All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back here to the Ford Room for our last, but certainly not least, Sacred Trust presentation for 2024. And the man who doesn't need any introduction in this room, but he's going to get one anyway, as our final speaker for Sacred Trust. We're so glad to have him, and we appreciate your participation in these wonderful educational opportunities that the Gettysburg Foundation and co-sponsored with the Gettysburg National Military Park here this afternoon. And great things we could tell about Scott. I'm actually going to read some of this so I don't screw it up, because there's a lot of great things we could say about him, but I want to make sure that I get all of this right. Scott Hartwig was the supervising park ranger at the Gettysburg National Military Park until 2014, after a 34-year career at the National Park Service, and nearly all of it spent here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. He won the regional Freeman Tilden Award for Excellence in Interpretation in 1993 and was a key player for the design of all aspects of the current Gettysburg National Military Park Museum and Visitor Center. So that includes all of the exhibits that you see inside the museum here when this structure was built back in 2008. Scott was integral in putting together the educational presentation that you all see today as one of the advisors for that project. He is the author of To Antietam Creek, the Maryland Campaign from September 3rd to September 16, published in September of 2012 by Johns Hopkins University Press, and I Dread the Thought of the Place, the Battle of Antietam, and the End of the Maryland Campaign, also published last year by Johns Hopkins University Press. Both of these works will be for sale after his presentation. You can get a signed copy out in the front lobby. Both of them, folks, are the standard for the Antietam Campaign. These will be the standard books, I think, for generations, and I'm running this, so I can say that in case you want to know, even if my opinion isn't right. But I think it will be on the Antietam Campaign, both before and after the battle. These are definitive seminal works for the Antietam Campaign, and our next speaker is the author of those, and we're just so glad to have him. So please help me welcome Scott Hartwig.
Well, first I want to thank Wayne for having me here. Wayne and I go way, way back. I remember him as a young, very thin, fast-talking, high-energy, licensed battlefield guide, and an amazing researcher. Always has been an amazing researcher, and I've always learned a lot from Wayne over the years, and I appreciate him having me here. I appreciate all of you folks for coming out here today to listen to me talk. Wayne sent me a text. He said to dress appropriately, for the weather, so I did. Even though we're inside, I'm glad we are, because probably halfway through my talk, if we were outside, you'd all be asleep. Because the heat just puts you to sleep, right? Just kind of lulls you. Or you would have left to go get something cold to drink. It's a safe bet that almost everybody in this room has read, or maybe somebody in your family has read, a book about a battle or a campaign in the American Civil War, and that most of us sitting in this room have an opinion about a general, a commander in those battles, McClellan or Lee at Antietam, Meade or Lee at Gettysburg, Grant, Sherman, Johnston, so on. We tend to at least know a lot about generals and generalship, or at least we think we do, right? We all have an opinion about it, right? But the thing I found in my years of working in the public history sector, working with the public, with the National Park Service, is that most people, even people who did some reading on the Civil War, really had not a really clear idea of what a Civil War battle was like. What we think of a Civil War battle, our image of a Civil War battle, is shaped primarily by Hollywood for our generation today. and the generations that are going to be coming. It's shaped by Hollywood. So you've seen, a lot of us have seen Gettysburg or Gods and Generals, if you could sit through that. Glory, Cold Mountain, North and South, Blue and Gray. And some of these films, like the crater scene in Cold Mountain and the final attack scene in Glory, I think are really well done. But a lot of them give us an impression of a Civil War battle that is typical of what I used to get oftentimes on the battlefield. How are these guys so stupid that they just stood out there in the open and just fired at each other? Because that's what they saw. That's what the movies told them they did. Well, when I worked on I Dread the Thought of the Place, one of my overriding objectives in this book was I wanted to write a book that told the story of what a battle in the American Civil War was like. That battle happened to be Antietam. It's a very well-documented battle. But I wanted to tell the story of the battle, the whole battle, not just the shooting part of the battle, but the aftermath of the battle, how everybody dealt with it, and they dealt with the wounded and the civilians and all that stuff. I wanted to get into the whole story of the battle. And today, that's what we're going to try to do, is is move up to the front and get an idea of what the face of battle was like for these soldiers who fought it. Because another thing that I often found with the public and in conversing with them is they tended to think that battles in the American Civil War were somehow different, somehow not as mean, not as cruel, not as awful as battles in World War I or World War II or Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. And so this is what Colonel James W. Jackson had to say about battle before the Battle of Antietam. He's writing to his wife in the summer of 1862. He asked me why Colonel Oliver resigned. Colonel Oliver was the colonel of the 47th Alabama. He resigned. I don't think he was fond of the smell of burned gunpowder and the rattle of shell, grape, and ball. Battle is a terrible thing, and it takes nerves of iron to stand the battles we are having in this country. It takes nerves of iron. Now, James Jackson probably would disagree with somebody today who would say battles in the Civil War were different. They weren't as mean, they weren't as cruel, they weren't as terrifying. I think James Jackson would say, yes, they were. They just were different. Technology may change, tactics may change, weapons may change, but the general nature of what a battle is like doesn't really change that much. So we're going to use a number of letters that were written after the Battle of Antietam, in the days and weeks after the battle, to get at the soldier experience. Because it's very hard when you have a battle in which, like Gettysburg, you have 165,000 men. In Antietam, you have about 125,000 men who are participating in the battle. It's very hard to generalize because every soldier who fights in that battle has their own experience, the difference from the soldier right beside him. So we're not going to try to generalize, but we are going to use these letters as departure points to get a sense, a feeling for what a battle was like for these men and how they grappled with it and what they remembered of it and what they wanted to tell you about it. I'm also going to use a couple of post-war accounts, reminiscences. Those, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but those always have to be used with a great deal of caution, because there's a lot of hindsight that creeps into those, and they're generally not nearly as reliable as things that are written closer to the battle, particularly when you're trying to get at the experience of soldiers. But the two accounts that I'm going to use, these two reminiscences, are among the finest that I've read from the Civil War. So that's what we're going to try to do to get an understanding of the battle. Now, this is the Antietam battlefield here, and if you've never been there, I'd be surprised, disappointed. But some of you may not have been there. I mean, it's possible. If you haven't been there, it's an undulating landscape. It's like big ocean waves rolling over the landscape. That's kind of the way it is. And in 1862, it's an agricultural landscape today, but in 1862, it was a really idyllic agricultural landscape. There was a lot of Germans who'd settled in the area. Of course, there was always some Scotch and Irish down there too, and some English. And they had these beautiful farms, big barns, outbuildings, orchards, big gardens, plowed fields, meadows, pastures, cornfields. Every farm had a cornfield. And I'll try and use this to point out. Right there is the miller's cornfield, which became at Antietam known as the cornfield. But every farm had a cornfield, and they generally were pretty big. Miller's was 30 acres. The corn was ready to be harvested. It was 7 to 10 feet tall, so once you were in the corn, you couldn't see anything outside of it. And there were rail fences everywhere that segregated fields and property boundaries, and some stone fences, but mainly rail fences. And then also another characteristic of the Antietam landscape, which you could see in that first image that was up there, is these limestone outcroppings that are all over the battlefield to this day, and were at the time of the battle, and provided really good cover oftentimes for soldiers in the midst of the battle. There are 3 woodlots on the battlefield: Eastwood, Northwood, Westwoods. Very original names. Actually, they were all owned by somebody, but it just became an easy thing to identify them because the people after the battle, the soldiers who were writing reports, aren't trying to document who owns what. So the Eastwoods, Westwoods, Northwoods. These woods were oak, hickory, very mature woodlots. You could almost drive a carriage. You actually could drive a carriage through some of them. That's what some of the participants said. There's very little underbrush that's in there. So that's the Antietam battlefield. Of course, you have Antietam Creek that runs through the eastern boundary of the battlefield. One of the myths about Antietam Creek is that it was like up to your ankle. Anybody could walk across it really, really easily. It was not that way. In some places, the banks were very, very steep. You could not cross any ammunition wagons or artillery over it. You needed to control bridges or fords to get over. And even at some of the fords, like Prize Fords, Navalie's Ford, a lot of participants mentioned that the water came up to their thighs or their waist. So it wasn't the sort of thing you could just skip across, particularly if there were defenders on the other side. And the town of Sharpsburg was about 700 people at the time of the battle. Our first soldier, I should go back to that slide, because the red dot that you see up here, which is just south of Miller's Cornfield, is where our first soldier we're going to hear from is engaged in the battle. His name is Rufus Dawes. He is the major of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry. He's 23 years old on this day. And he and his men of his regiment had begun the morning about a mile north of Miller's Cornfield on the Joseph Poffenberger farm. And they were awakened. They moved from the Poffenberger farm. As they were actually trying to get away from the Poffenberger farm, they got hit by a Confederate shell that killed and wounded 14 men in the regiment. One shell. They went through the Northwoods, crossed a big plowed field, went through a pasture, skirmished with rebels who they couldn't even see, who were firing at them from concealed positions, drove them out of the Miller farmyard, went through the Miller farmyard, went into the cornfield, through the cornfield, became engaged on the right flank, and then the men with Dawes actually went through the cornfield to the southern side of the cornfield. This is the first time that they're going to see the rebels, like real bona fide Confederates out in front of them. Both sides see one another, and Dawes picks up the account of what happens. As we appeared at the edge of the corn, a long line of men in butternut and gray rose up from the ground. Simultaneously, the hostile battle lines opened a tremendous fire upon one another. Men, I cannot say, fell. They were knocked out of the ranks by dozens. But we jumped over the fence and pushed on, loading, firing, and shouting as we advanced. There was on the part of the men great hysterical excitement, eagerness to go forward, and a reckless disregard of life, of everything but victory. Men and officers of New York and Wisconsin, soldiers of the 14th Brooklyn, were mingled with soldiers of the 6th Wisconsin at this point in the fight that he's describing, are fused into a common mass in the frantic struggle to shoot fast. Everybody tears cartridges, loads, passes guns, or shoots. Men are falling in their places or running back into the corn. The soldier who is shooting is furious in his energy. The soldier who is shot looks around for help with an imploring agony of death on his face. The men are loading and firing with demoniacal fury and shouting and laughing hysterically. and the whole field in front of us is covered with rebels fleeing for life into the woods. So let's unpack a little bit of what Dawes is saying in this account to us about combat. So the first thing, this combat is kind of like what we might imagine Civil War combat is. The men are out in the open, and they're firing into one another. He says the rebels rise up from the ground to fire at them. Now, there's numerous instances that I encountered in Antietam that the soldiers, when they were engaged, knelt or laid down on the ground. Now, it's hard to load a Civil War rifle laying on the ground. They did it. When your life's on the line, you'll figure out how to do those sorts of things. But in Dawes' case, there it is. They're out in the open, and they're blazing away at each other. And what he also tells us is that when formed infantry, and we also oftentimes never understood why soldiers fought this way in the Civil War. Why were they in closely packed ranks, almost shoulder to shoulder with one another, 2 ranks deep? It seems stupid that you would expose yourself like that. Well, you're carrying a slow-firing weapon, fires 2 to 3 aim shots a minute. So to concentrate your fire, you concentrate your men. You have no radio communications. The only communications you have are hand signals, voice signals, flags, drums, bugles, whatever you might be using. They're not generally going to use drums on the battlefield. So you have to concentrate your soldiers in order for them to hear your commands. So that's the reason they fight this way. But what Dawes tells us is that those tactics that they need to use are really expensive. Like, men are knocked out of the ranks, he says, by the dozens. So you can imagine this situation. He also is telling us that there was on the part of the men great hysterical excitement. That's an adjective that he throws in there that's very deliberate. Not just great excitement, hysterical excitement. This is combat. They're not making a movie. This is real combat. Everybody's really amped up and excited. And the other thing we might imagine is, oh man, I mean, these guys would just take cover. Some of these guys are going to try and run for the rear. That's not what he's saying. Great eagerness to go forward. Get at them. Now, this is also symptomatic of a good unit. Like, this is a well-led unit. These guys are really well-disciplined. They're good fighters. And then he tells us there's a reckless disregard of life. A number of soldiers that I encountered talked about this. Once they really came under fire, they just stopped thinking about they might get shot. They just wanted to destroy the enemy. And those who disappeared from the fighting, and there were plenty of them, were in the minority. So these guys, there's a disregard of life, of everything but victory. And then he tells us that the soldiers of his regiment and the men of the 14th Brooklyn are kind of mused together or fused together in a common mass in the frantic struggle to shoot fast. You're carrying this muzzle-loading rifle. He needs a ramrod to load and fire it. So he tells us what they're doing. Everybody tears cartridges, loads, passes guns, or shoots. That means they got shooters, they got passers, and they got loaders. That makes them fire faster. So the name of the game is fire as fast as you possibly can. Because if the other guys can fire faster than you, you're going to hit more of you. So this is an interesting, we oftentimes think, oh yeah, the 2 lines are standing there and they're following the drill and everything like that. Dawes is saying no. No, they're doing everything they can to give them the edge in this combat. The soldier who is shooting is furious in his energy. The soldier who is shot looks around for help with an imploring agony of death on his face. I'm sure Dawes saw many of those men around him who were probably asking him for help. And you cannot afford to detail any men to help some of these guys, even though some soldiers do. They'll drag a guy back into the corn where he's got some cover and run back up to the firing line. Some of that happens, but most of the times you're hit, you got to get yourself off the field or get to some sort of cover where some of your comrades then maybe later can pick you up and carry you back. But for someone like Dawes, he's an officer. His job is to direct his men. His job is to direct the fire of his men. His job is not to try to deal with the casualties that he's got around him. That's another job for somebody else. But that doesn't mean if you're a sympathetic, empathetic sort of human being like Rufus Dawes, that doesn't have an impact upon you. He writes how the men are loading and firing with demoniacal fury. There's that other, great hysterical excitement. Demoniacal fury. Not just fury, like scary fury. I want to destroy these people in front of me. Destroy them. That is the type of fury we're talking about. And what you want to try and do, like when you're working on a book like I did, is you want to try and get at the real battle, the battle that these men fought, the battle that these men lived. Because we as civilians can't understand their world if you've never been in something like that. And very, very few people living in the United States today have been in anything like that. This is, they're shouting and laughing hysterically. Another thing, you're like, what? Laughing hysterically? Rebels are running for their lives? It's this energy that's pent up in them. They're so angry, and they're this demoniacal fury, and then they see the Rebs running, and then they got them. We got them. We're going to destroy these guys. They're laughing and shouting, and it's like, I'm alive. I'm alive. I made it. I'm going to kill these guys. It tells us something about the nature of battle that is a little unsettling to what we might imagine a Civil War battle is like. Now, the next soldier we're going to move on to is a little ways south of David Miller's cornfield. And this is a Confederate captain, Fred Richardson. He's in the 5th Louisiana Infantry. He actually will be killed in action on July 2nd on Cemetery Hill with the 5th Louisiana, less than a year after the Battle of Antietam. And Fred Richardson, his unit is Harry Hayes's Louisiana Brigade. Sometimes people would call them the Louisiana Tigers. They had some pretty wild dudes in this brigade, for sure. And they are in the West Woods when the Battle of Antietam opens. But shortly after, the attack upon the Confederate front is so furious that the brigade is ordered out of the West Woods to where the red dot is, and that's a pasture. It's just an open pasture. Now, it's kind of in a bowl, but it was under terrific artillery fire, both from across Antietam Creek to the east and from the north by batteries of the First Corps. Now, Fred Richardson is going to experience a very horrific incident here in this position. And I forgot to mention early on that some of these letters that I'm going to read to you the content in them is pretty tough. And I don't read these things because I want to shock people. I have no interest in doing that. My purpose is to make you have an understanding of the battle these people experienced. So Fred Richardson, after the battle, writes a letter that is sent to the Memphis Daily Appeal because his lieutenant, Nick Canfield, and his brother, William, were both from Memphis. And they must have made their way down to New Orleans and then ended up in the 5th Louisiana Infantry. So Captain Fred Richardson is writing this letter to the Memphis Daily Appeal to be published in the newspaper in the hopes that Nick Canfield and William Canfield's parents will see it. So you're the parents, and this is the letter that you might read in the newspaper, and I want you to think about whether this is going to give you comfort. The circumstances attending his death, Nick Canfield, are as follows. Our brigade was ordered into a cornfield with the support of 2 batteries, which were firing from either flank. Shortly after obtaining our position, the enemy's shells came so thick and fast that General Hayes ordered us to lie down. See, they don't stand up like they do in the movies. Our company was small, and we, the officers, laid down behind it. William, Lieutenant Canfield's brother, was leaning immediately to his front. Nick was reclining on his elbow, conversing with Lieutenant Gobbins of our camp. Lieutenant Fitzpatrick of Company B by the side of him was struck, and Nick remarked, "Fitz, you are hit." Many of those surrounding us were uttering strong exclamations of, "Oh!" etc. as they were shot, when all at once a shell from the enemy plunged through my poor camp, passing first through the body of William, then cut off the leg of John Fitzsimmons, then both feet of D. Jenkins, and passed through my poor friend Nick, entering at the small of the back, coming out of his breast, tearing out and exposing his heart. I immediately jumped up, but he was beyond the possibility of being assisted. I advanced my face close to his and called him by name, but his eyes were fixed, and he was still supporting himself on his elbow in his last throes. Oh, the anguish I felt at the sight of my poor friend, who a moment before was buoyant in spirits, even while the leaden messengers of death were dealing destruction around us, now in the hands of his Maker. And the thought rushed fast to my mind of the feelings of his poor mother and family, on hearing of the loss of her 2 boys, the pride of her heart. And there's 2 things I want to talk about in this letter. The first is this letter reveals to us how destructive artillery fire was. Now, the medical surgical history of the Civil War says that 90% of all casualties in the Civil War were caused by small arms, rifles, carbines, maybe some pistols. And about 10% were caused by artillery, and the last almost 1% is caused by bayonets, swords, clubs, rocks, all sorts of stuff like that. I think that is probably true for the war in general, although surgeons did not differentiate between a shrapnel ball and a musket ball. They both look very similar to one another. They probably called shrapnel balls musket balls, and that's how they reported the wound. A shell fragment is different. That's a shell fragment, so that's going to be an artillery wound. But even some canister balls sometimes could be smaller. And I'm sure surgeons sometimes mistook a wound from a canister ball to a musket ball. Even writing long after the war, Francis Barlow gets wounded in the Battle of Antietam near the Sunken Lane. He writes that he couldn't tell the difference. He says, I don't know what it was. He says, I don't know if it was a musket ball, shrapnel ball, canister ball. He says, I could never tell the difference between any of them. So that wasn't necessarily unusual. I do think, though, that Antietam and Gettysburg are 2 particular examples where there were excellent fields of fire for artillery. And any infantry that exposed themselves just drew a storm of artillery fire, and artillery inflicted a lot of casualties. So the circumstantial evidence that I found is that there were a large number of casualties caused by artillery fire. How many? Well, I have no idea. Could be 20%, could have been 30%. I don't think it was probably more than that. Most are still caused by small arms. But artillery, the other thing about this, that's 1 shell that comes in here, and you see the damage that it does. That is demoralizing to anybody who's near it. That's how you can break the will of a unit. You've got a few of those landing into an infantry unit, and I guarantee they're not going to stay in the open. And during the course of the battle, the Federals built up this huge artillery line in front of the East Woods, extending all the way up to Poffenberger Hill, way, way north of the cornfield. And any Confederate unit that emerged into the open did not stand a chance. There were a couple that tried it, and they just got blown back into the woods and cover. So the artillery was very destructive at Antietam, both Confederate artillery and Union artillery as well. The other part of this letter that I wanted to talk about is, would you be comforted by this letter if you got it? Yeah, I don't think so. I wouldn't be. Why is he telling us this? Why did he need to tell us this? Couldn't he just say a shell came in and exploded and killed 4 men, and your son Nick died bravely and he died immediately? Couldn't he just say that? He could have just said that. He could have left all these details. Why do you have to say that, the one guy lost his leg and they blew both feet off another guy and it went right through the body of William? What is the reason for the level of detail in here? Well, I don't think this letter was entirely for Nick Canfield and William Canfield's mother. It was for Fred Richardson. Because this is how Fred Richardson dealt with the trauma that he was exposed to. And this was definite trauma that he was exposed to. This is how Fred Richardson dealt with it. He wrote it down. He documented it. He wasn't trying to shock the people in Memphis, like, hey, this is the real battle. This is what it's really like. I want you to know. That wasn't what I think he was trying to do. He was just trying to remember. I don't want to forget what happened. I have to write it down because that's the only way I can deal with this or I'm going to go insane. I think this was for Fred Richardson. I don't think it was necessarily for the mother. It certainly wasn't to comfort the mother. This isn't the only, we'll have another letter coming up that has a similar theme to it as this one. Well, we'll move on now to a young soldier from Wisconsin, 7th Wisconsin Infantry. He is, his name is Hugh Perkins, tough dude. His regiment moves from just north of Miller's cornfield across the Hagerstown Pike at the Miller Farm and moves up into the West Woods. And when they come into the West Woods, they came up behind Confederate soldiers who were on the Hagerstown Pike firing at the 6th Wisconsin and 2nd Wisconsin and 14th Brooklyn and those guys up there. They came up behind them and had the Confederates dead to rights because they were right in their rear and started to fire into their rear. And Hugh Perkins is writing after the battle to a friend of his named Herbert. Now, oftentimes soldiers' letters to friends contain some of the most gritty content because they're going to tell them things they're not going to tell their parents or other people, or certainly not something that they're going to publish. So in these, a lot of times they get into things that they're just not going to share with other people. So the bottom letter we'll read first. September 21st, he writes to Herbert. Herbert, I've seen some hard times and a good deal more than I expected to. My comrades and tent mates have fell on each side of me and I'm alive and without a scratch. I've had over 100 good fair shots at the graybacks, and I've got so that I can shoot just as cool and deliberate at them as I can at a prairie chicken or pigeon. I know of 3 that I have made bite the dust, besides a great many others that I am pretty sure I hit. I've had balls come so close that they made my face smart, but it didn't break the hide. It has got so it does not excite me any more to be in action than to be in a cornfield hoeing or digging potatoes. Now, based on Rufus Dawes' account, I don't believe that last sentence. I'm sure he's a cool customer. I'm sure this guy's a tough dude, but I don't believe he's not excited in combat. The other thing in this first letter that's interesting and somewhat unusual is, he tells his friend, hey, I killed 3 guys. I'm sure of it. And I probably hit a few others. That's unusual. Most Confederate soldiers, or most soldiers in the Civil War, Union and Confederate, don't generally talk about that because they're not proud of killing a person. That's their duty as a soldier, but they're not really proud of it. I don't know that Perkins is proud of it. I think Perkins is just stating it as a fact. This is what I did. Now, 5 days later, he writes Herbert again. And it's interesting, some of the things he writes to Herbert are the same things he wrote to him 5 days earlier. So I don't know what's going on inside Perkins' mind, but he also shares some more about the battle now. It is with pleasure I take my pen in hand to let you know that I'm still alive and well. I've been in 6 very hard and hand-to-hand fights. Now, he hasn't been in any hand-to-hand fights. He's been in some really battles that the range is really close, but there's no hand-to-hand fights. We had a splendid position at the last fight, Antietam. We were brought up in rear of a brigade of rebels and laid in the woods and fired 20 rounds before we were discovered, piling them in heaps as they lay down behind a stone wall. After they discovered our position, they threw down their arms and broke for the woods, what was left of them. Then we had fun picking them off. We might have taken them all prisoner, but we wasn't in for that. We killed every one of them. Even a wounded man could not be seen creeping off without being plugged by a Mini. They refused to surrender to us, but they had to our Mini balls. I was on a detail to bury the dead for 3 days. It was an awful job. It made me feel bad to see our poor boys laying dead. But the Rebs didn't have no more effect on me than so many sheep. I've seen some hard times and run some narrow chances all my life, but I hope I shall always come out as well as I have so far. Now, there may be some exaggeration in this, but Perkins is getting at something that's really uncomfortable for any of us to consider in these battles, is that we had fun picking them off, he says. We had the drop on them. They were helpless. They were running. We were just picking them off as they're going. Now, we have to have some context here about this, is that 3 days before this, Hugh Perkins' regiment at the Battle of South Mountain was executing a maneuver, swinging their regiment around in front of a large number of Confederates who were concealed and hidden from them. And the Confederates waited until they presented their flank to them, and then the Confederates just poured it into them. And we don't know if in that battle Confederates were shooting down some men who were trying to get away, or maybe some men who might have tried to surrender. We don't know what happened exactly. We know that the 7th Wisconsin took a lot of casualties in that battle. And it's possible that in this battle, Hugh Perkins and his comrades are like, we're taking retribution, man, because this is the real war. This is the way the game is played. And if they got us on the drop, they're not going to have any mercy on us. Now, I think he exaggerates this. They did take prisoners. And they didn't shoot everybody. A lot of Confederates got away in this particular engagement here. So I think he's exaggerating things a little bit for him. But Perkins is a reminder to us of how grim these battles could get. But it's also important not to take Perkins out of context and say, oh, see, that's the way it was, man. That is it. That's the way all these engagements were. All this other stuff, it's all like they tried to candy coat the battle. Well, I can tell you numerous incidents that I encountered in the research of this book where soldiers from one side are showing tremendous mercy to soldiers on the other side. There's a Confederate soldier on the morning of September 18th who risks his life to help Union wounded down near the 9th Corps battlefield and gets killed by a Union sharpshooter because the sharpshooter didn't know he was trying to help him. But he was actually trying to go out and help these people. There's a Confederate soldier that I have an account from who he's out in front of the East Woods. He's exposed to fire. Union soldiers picked him up, carried him into the East Woods, put him behind a tree where he had cover, and then gave him a canteen of water and then moved back out to keep fighting. So for every Hugh Perkins story, you can find another story where people showed mercy to one another. But that's the nature of a battlefield. It's not all one thing or all another thing. Now we'll move into the West Woods. And about 9 o'clock in the morning of the battle, on the day of the battle, the infantry division of General John Sedgwick entered the battlefield. They were in the 2nd Corps. They were one of the best divisions in the Army of the Potomac. And they were very poorly led by the Corps commander, Edwin Sumner, who led them into the West Woods where they were outflanked. And in about 15 to 20 minutes, they lost 2,200 men, which is probably the greatest slaughter in that amount of time that any unit in the Civil War was subjected to. I mean, it was a terrific massacre and rout of a really good unit of the Army of the Potomac. And one of the soldiers who was in there was Lieutenant Samuel Hodgman. He was with the 7th Michigan Infantry. And Sam Hodgman, to know where the 7th Michigan is, if you're familiar with Antietam, if you go into the Philadelphia Brigade Park in the West Woods, you're driving in that little road. As you're driving in that road, if you go to the left of the road to the edge of the woods, that's where the 7th Michigan was located. Sam Hodgman gets wounded in the battle, and later in the fall, in November, he writes his father to tell him about the battle. And he writes about a lot of different things. I just picked out a few things that I thought were really interesting from his long letter. He writes to his father, he says, in regard to incidents in the Battle of Antietam, I had my hands full in getting a couple of soldiers who had heretofore managed to keep out of danger under fire. By close watching and sundry threats, I got them to face the music. One of them lost his life, the other was shot through the thigh. This last, I suspected at the time, had swallowed some tobacco and commenced vomiting when we were within a few rods of the line where so many of us were to fall. I did not, under the circumstance, feel any compunctions of conscience, but placed my sword against him and pushed him along. Had it not been for me, one would probably have saved his life, and the other preserved his leg unhurt. However, my conscience does not accuse me of murder. Now, do you think his conscience bothers him at all? Yeah, I think it actually probably does. I think that's why he's writing about it. I mean, he's conflicted. He's conflicted. These two bums, they said at every fight, all my other guys, they go into the fight, I'm going to make them fight this time. And then one of them gets killed, one gets badly wounded. By the way, the guy who was badly wounded survived the war, actually. I think he is a little bit conflicted here. But it also tells us something about what it took sometimes with some men to make them do their duty. We like to imagine that, they're veterans, everybody needs to be venerated, everybody's a hero, they're all courageous, they all do their duty, and they don't all do their duty. They're not all courageous. There's numerous instances at the Battle of Antietam of tremendous heroism and great cowardice on both sides, from generals to privates. Remember what Colonel Jackson said. It takes nerves of steel to stand in battles that we're fighting. And some of these guys, they just cannot do it. There's a captain in the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, Albert Hu was commanded one of the skirmish companies of the 6th. And Hu was known as, he knew the drill manual, Hardee's Tactics, better than probably anybody in the entire regiment. His father had been a regular Army officer. Hu was an excellent soldier, and until the bullets started flying. It paralyzed him, just absolutely paralyzed him. And at Antietam, that was finally the last straw. He hid behind a tree. His company scattered to the four winds. And after the battle was over, the colonel made Hu resign from the Army. And then Hu was able to go home, kind of saving some face. But he was an example of a person who, he was a great garrison soldier. But to stand this stuff, it was tough. It was really tough. And Hodgman has to put his sword right up to the back of this guy, drive him right into the fight. Now again, like I said with Hugh Perkins' letter, be careful about taking this out of context because it's easy to do. Oh, see, that's what it took. Get guys to fight in the Civil War. You had to have somebody standing behind you with a sword. Well, Hodgman probably had about 35 men in his company. 2 he had to keep an eye on because they scampered out of every other battle. The others all did their duty. So the majority of men, like Rufus Dawes wrote in his account, do their duty. They go into the fight. Even though they're terrified, everybody's scared. But some people are so scared that they can't do it. And as this one fellow goes, I mean, it's really a tragic story. I mean, he swallows his tobacco. He's so terrified. He starts throwing up, trying to do anything so that he doesn't have to go into this fight. I would like to know what could be the feelings of a person if he could be in a position where he could have seen the whole of the fight on that bloody 17th of September. It was perfectly awful where we were. Infantry in front and in flank, artillery in flank and in front, all pouring in upon us a terrible storm of iron and lead. It seemed almost a miracle that any escaped. I did not feel in the least degree any desire to get out of the way until after I was wounded. I then had to turn my back to the enemy and was not very ambitious to see how long I could stay amongst the balls. They were flying all around each side, over and front and behind me, and like plums in a pudding, the shells were bursting in every direction. Still, there seemed to be a clear spot for me to escape in as though it was specially ordered for my benefit. I could not help admiring the scene, terrible as it was and full of danger at every step. The bursting shells were the most terrible and grand part of the scene. There's another part of the battle that is sometimes you wouldn't imagine. There's something grand and terrible about all of this. There's something spectacular about this. And he's wounded. He's trying to get off the field. There's dead and wounded men lying around. But he takes a moment. He's like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. A lot of soldiers have that same experience. I suppose there has never been in any battle ever yet fought more terrible fighting and in proportion to the number engaged, more slaughter than in the Battle of Antietam. None avoided the contest. All fought like heroes, both Union and Rebel. The rebels had the advantage in position and numbers, we in pluck and artillery. Had they attacked us, we should have had the advantage in position as well as in arms. But as it was, we had to leave our own position and attack them in theirs. And had it not been for the cowardly surrender of the almost impregnable position of Harper's Ferry, our victory would have been complete. I don't understand how that could be. I cannot give any instances of personal daring among our men. They had no opportunity to distinguish themselves personally. All stood together to shoot and be shot. We had no hand-to-hand fighting. The one that could load and fire the fastest did the Rebs the most damage. I do not doubt, but if a charge had been made, there would have been some desperate and bloody work done. I would probably have got a chance to use my revolver. As it was, it hung in my belt perfectly useless. I had to fire it off after I got to the hospital and think that I should have hurt somebody if they had got in my way. Long as I have been in the service, I have never yet fired a shot at the Secesh. Now, interesting thing in this letter, in this part of the letter, is none avoided the contest. Well, didn't those two guys try to avoid the contest? But they didn't, right? That's how Hodgman's going to remember it. They didn't avoid the contest. He made them go in, but they didn't avoid the contest. All fought like heroes. But those two guys didn't necessarily fight like heroes. They didn't want to be there. They wanted to get away. But he made them fight like heroes. And other interesting thing here is both Union and Rebel. He respects his enemy. They fought bravely. They are tough. They are a tough opponent. I respect them. That's another interesting fact of this feature of this letter, which is also, again, not unusual. Now we're going to move south towards the famous Sunken Lane, this old sunken farm lane that connected the Hagerstown Pike to the Boonesboro Turnpike, and was occupied by 2 Confederate brigades who were reinforced during the course of the fighting by more Confederate brigades, and it was attacked by 2 different Union divisions. The first one was William French's division, and they struck the Sunken Lane from the north, engaged in terrifically bloody fighting. They did not put a dent in the Confederate line in the lane. They lost 1,700 men in the course of less than an hour. And the soldier we'll hear from here was a captain in that division in the 14th Indiana Infantry, William Houghton. He's writing to his mother on September the 30th. And he starts the letter off, "I could a tale unfold. 'Twas an awful fight, mother, and death reigned like an avenging angel over us. I'm wounded. Don't start. It's only a scratch, merely a mini ball through my left arm. No bones broken, wound doing nicely, and my spirits excellent. But the boys, mother, are nearly all wounded who are with me. You will doubtless have seen some accounts of the killed and wounded before you see this, but I know you will be anxious. I've had no chance to write. My heart failed me when I thought of penning the records of that bloody day. But it is better that everything should be known." So it tells me that William Houghton couldn't bring himself to write this until September 30th. He needed time. He needed time to kind of grapple with what he'd gone through. And you'll see why. The rebel masses on our right and early on the 17th, we were ordered to the right. All knew that a terrible fight was to be fought, and all were determined to keep up the honor of the 14th Indiana. We formed in battle line about 2 miles from the main fight. We moved in 3 columns, and we moved in the second. They were actually in the 3rd column. We moved fast. The Rebs shelled us all the way. Our boys were brave, steady, and true. The 1st column drove them a little, but the regiment ahead of us, 6th Maryland, it was actually the 5th Maryland, soon broke and ran to us. 'Twas then that the 14th showed her nerve. They ordered the cowards back with threats, called them cowards, asked them if they were not ashamed to see the stars and stripes moving from the rebel flag. Finding some too cowardly to shame, they gave then 3 groans and then 3 rousing cheers for the Union. Every man shouted forward. There's that shouting again. One of those things we try to imagine the battlefield. A lot of shouting. Guys are shouting and yelling. Kimball, he was their brigade commander, General Nathan Kimball, told them that the day depended on us and ordered us in. We went with a rush and a yell, hurled the advancing column of rebels back, and there were some Confederate attacks that came out of the Sunken Lane that attempted to drive the Union forces away. And that's what he's describing, driving back into the lane. And the grape and canister, shot and shells screamed and whistled over us and around us till the air was dark and destruction seemed to stalk with undisputed sway. I saw my brave boys fall like sheep led to the slaughter. Bryant was shot through the brain. McCord was shot near the heart, and while the lifeblood was gushing from the wound, he sat up and with an almost heavenly smile playing in his features. He told us he was dying, but to mind him not. He was happy, and we must go and avenge his death. "Farewell, boys! Farewell, Captain!" he exclaimed. As I reached for him, he fell forward on the earth. We held our ground for 4 long hours. We went in with 60 rounds of cartridges, shot them all away, and had taken all that we found in the dead and wounded men's boxes. We fought 10 times our numbers. That's what it seemed like to him. That wasn't 10 times their numbers. They were about equal in number. Maybe they had a slight advantage over the Confederates. We were flanked by a brigade on our right, and destruction seemed inevitable. But we never gave an inch. He underlined that for his mom. "Tell them that, Mother. When they saw we were all wounded, relief would not come because when we attempted to fall back, the rascals ran." That's not really true. Our boys became desperate. Every officer mounted the hill with his hat in one hand and his sword in the other. The men yelled like demons and fought like infuriated madmen. There's that demons and infuriated madmen that Dawes was talking about. The rebels at last broke and ran like sheep from the squad that was left of our brigade. They actually ran because they got outflanked by a lot of other Union troops who came up on them. It wasn't just Houghton's men, but this is how he sees the battle. Relief came up gallantly after the danger was over, and we fell back for ammunition. I had 11 men able to do duty, and most of them injured with spent balls. I was wounded in the early part of the fight, but remained in the field. I was hit below the elbow against the bone and lodged against the skin. Doctor squeezed it out of the left arm hole, and I carry it in my pocket. I cannot give more details. My arm hurts. I'm resting here, and I'm going to Washington soon. No trouble. I'm all right. I can't give you a perfect list at present, but we'll give you the most important list to meet the eye of the friends. But God reigns, and we bow to his dictates. We're going to come back to God in the next letter, but what Houghton is saying is, hey, God reigns. You know, we mortals, we can't affect how things are going to turn out. It's just the way it is, and, you know, I can't change it. He tells us that he gets shot in the arm, right? Pretty big deal, I would say. If I got shot in the arm, and my left arm, and it went through the arm, and it lodged against the bone, that would be kind of a big deal. But it isn't a big deal when your soldier named Bryant shot through the brain beside you and killed, and McCord gets shot through the heart, and you see the blood pumping out of him, and he tells you, you know, goodbye, Captain, farewell, boys, farewell, Captain, avenge my death, don't worry about me. You can't forget that. That's going to haunt you the rest of your life. That's why Houghton can't bring himself to write this letter, but then he thinks about it, and he's like, I have to write this letter. It's just like Fred Richardson had to tell the story of how his friends died. He has to tell the story. That I want to remember this. Keep this letter. I want to remember it, but I also want people who might read this letter to know what we went through, what we suffered, how we prevailed ultimately. This is, again, not an unusual letter. By the way, that is where William Houghton was, right up here. This is the Sunken Lane. The 14th Indiana was right up there on that little hill. Now we move into the Sunken Lane to a Confederate soldier in the 6th Alabama Infantry. His name is Thomas Taylor. He's a sergeant. And he's writing only 3 days after the battle to his mother and father. By this time, the enemy could be seen marching slowly but steadily on to us. I knew we had to fight and made up my mind to give them the best that I had when they got near enough. Colonel Gordon gave the command to fire on them. This we did, and we continued to fire. This was the hardest fight I ever was in. When the battle was at its hottest, I could see column after column advancing towards us. I think I saw 4 flags. This would be 4 regiments. The enemy got up once within 30 yards of us. I thought they had me this time, but determined that my life should cost them dearly. I could see my brave companions falling on the right and left. Colonel Gordon, John B. Gordon, was wounded, and all our whole company nearly. Lieutenant Perry was killed. There were about 8 or 10 of us left of 2 companies, and I began to think of leaving. The few of our regiment left had all gone, our whole company going with 3 or 4 exceptions. I hung my head and I breathed a prayer to God for my deliverance. I waited a moment, and then I started. I came off safe and unhurt. God be praised, I felt thankful and would have been willing to have fallen on my knees and publicly thanked him for my deliverance. I believe that nothing but the mercy of God saved me. My dear Father, I vowed the most solemn vows that day, intend to serve God the remainder of my days. I'm not afraid to die. No, I feel that to die would be my gain. But I want to live for my dear wife and children and to be more useful to the world, and believe I will live to see the end of this war. Well, he would not live to see the end of the war. He would be killed at Spotsylvania Courthouse. But he seems like a very conflicted fellow here. I'm not afraid to die. I don't want to die. I don't think he does want to die, because he runs away from the Sunken Lane to save his life, and he's amazed that he survived. But you can understand why when you look at this picture, because that's where he was, right there. That's the position of the 6th Alabama, right in front of you. All those bodies laying in there, those are his comrades. So that's where Thomas Taylor was located. And that's the same picture you were just looking at earlier. 14th Indiana was up on that hill, other units. You can see how dangerous it is. So if you're Thomas Taylor, how do you account for the fact that when all these guys around you got caught, shot down, you got away? How do you account for that? Is that just luck? Not in that society. That's not luck. The only way you survived is God. God intervened. God had a purpose for you. God had a reason for you to survive. As William Houghton said, God reigns. But what Tom Taylor is saying is, I think God intervened. And I'd sink to my knees and thank him for my deliverance, that I survived to live another day. So he's telling us again of these deep emotions that people are feeling, but also the conflict that they're kind of going through when the battle is over. So when the shooting stops and the armies have to clean up the battlefield, the most difficult duty that a soldier would have to engage in after the battle was over was the burial of the dead. Now, they would form details from the combat units to go out and do the burials of the dead. They buried some of the dead on September 18th, both armies, and then on the 19th, after the Confederate Army retreated, the Union Army completed the rest of the burials. They buried a lot of Confederate soldiers at this time period. Any soldiers who were kind of in between the lines really weren't able to be reached on the 18th. But being on a burial detail was, it wasn't the sort of thing oftentimes people volunteered for. You were detailed for it. You didn't volunteer for it because it was a very tough job to do this. And one of the men who did volunteer for it, though, was Austin Carr. And in his diary, he describes an incident that occurs while he's on the burial detail. And this is a photograph of a Union burial detail on the 19th of September. It's not terribly far from the David Miller farm, but this is not Austin Carr. But it gives us an idea of what a detail would look like. Austin Carr's best friend is killed in the West Woods in Sedgwick's disaster. And Carr volunteers because Carr wants to find his body. He wants to bury his friend. And they find him. And this is what he describes. Somehow I felt bitter in my heart against this thing called war. The shoes had been stripped from his feet. A gold ring had been torn from his finger. He'd been robbed of the little things that were so very dear to him. We buried him away from the others on the side of the hill. I could scarcely bring myself to look upon his crude grave. Tears gushed down my face in spite of all my efforts to stop them. And so I bid him goodbye and left him there to sleep. The bitter wound in my heart to last forever. I wondered why God tolerated this damnable thing called war. So Carr is deeply affected by the death of his friend. This just really affects him. He can't control his emotions. He's crying. And he's different than Tom Taylor. He's not saying, God, hey, you preserved me. You saved my life. I got through this. That's not what he's saying. He's like, God, why did you let this happen? Why do you let this happen? This sort of slaughter. I don't understand it. So, again, it's not all one thing and all another thing. Everybody's not one way or another way. If people are conflicted, this is a horrific event that these people are trying to grapple with and understand. And Carr is deeply affected by this. But we get a different perspective from Lieutenant Josiah Favell. He's in the 57th New York, fights down near the Sunken Lane, and he goes out and walks over the battlefield on the morning of September 19th. And advancing over the hill, we found it covered with dead men, mostly our men. But just below on the sunken road over which we originally charged, the rebel dead lay in regular ranks, so close together that it was hard to believe they were not living men in line of battle. Most of them had turned black with the 2 days' exposure, and it required more than a glance to convince ourselves they were not Negro troops. A lot of the gallant 57th fellows lay scattered about the hill, the ditch, and cornfield. Among them, conspicuous for his neatness and soldierly appearance, was Sergeant Risley of Company E, firmly grasping his musket, his features almost as natural as in life, and his appointments perfect in all respects. He was a fine fellow, much above the average in intelligence, and a splendid soldier, and like a soldier died, his face toward the foe. Much different perspective that Favell brings to the death of Sergeant Risley. Sergeant Risley had 3 kids, a wife at home. I don't know why he enlisted in the Army, but he did in 1861. He gets killed here. And the way Favell sees this is what we volunteered for. We're soldiers. And some of us are going to get killed. And Risley, he died like a good soldier. He was a good man. He was a brave man. And if I'm going to die, that's the way I want to die. It's kind of the way Favell is telling us. And again, we can't understand this unless you're in this like these men are. They see it differently. Carr sees it one way. He's very emotionally attached. Phil likes Risley, thinks he's one of the best soldiers he has. But what he sees here is that's a brave man, and he died bravely. But that's what happens to us in combat. Some of us die. Several men were shot while climbing a rail fence nearby. Some of them stuck fast, looking in one or two cases from a distance exactly like live men. There were men in every state of mutilation, sans arms, sans legs, heads, and intestines, and in greater number than on any field we have seen before. About noon, Colonel Brooke directed me to bury the dead in front of our brigade, and with a strong fatigue party, I immediately went to work. In one large grave, we buried 53 U.S. soldiers gathered on this side of the sunken road, and in two others, respectively, 173 and 85 rebel soldiers. We dug the ditches wide enough to hold two bodies, feet together, heads out, and long enough to hold all those the men had collected. When they were all carefully laid away, we threw over them some army blankets gathered on the field and then replaced the earth. How many shattered hopes we buried there, none of us may ever guess. War is certainly a dreadful thing and a battlefield an ugly blot on civilization. The country people flocked to the battlefield like vultures, their curiosity and inquisitiveness most astonishing. While my men were all at work, many of them stood around, dazed and awe-stricken by the terrible evidence of the great fight. Hundreds were scattered over the field, eagerly searching for souvenirs in the shape of cannonballs, guns, bayonets, swords, canteens, etc. They were all jubilant over the rebel defeat, of course, and claimed for us a mighty victory. I was much amused at the way they stared at me. Had I been the veritable Hector of Troy, I could scarcely have excited more curiosity than while in command of this burial party. I think the soldiers are, they're annoyed at these civilians. They don't have a right to pick up these souvenirs. They didn't earn the right. They weren't here. They weren't in this. And they're wandering around picking things up, awe-stricken. I think the soldiers tolerate him, but they didn't like him. But it also is another feature of a post-battle situation that we don't contemplate. Hundreds, thousands of people came to Antietam and to Gettysburg. Some to look for family members, but a lot of them just to do what Phil's talking about, just to walk over the battlefield, pick up souvenirs. The other thing that's interesting in this, he says, they were all jubilant over the rebel defeat, of course, and claimed for us a mighty victory. He doesn't claim a mighty victory. Phil doesn't see it that way. He's just, they're survivors in this one. Yeah, I'm glad the battle ended the way it did, but that's not the way Faville is viewing the outcome of the battle, as a winner and loser. But the people coming there to visit it are seeing it that way. And they look at him as a veritable Hector of Troy, because you look around, you see this, you're like, oh my God, you were in this? And you survived this? You are like Hector of Troy. All right, I know we're almost done. We got to get done here. I just want to wrap up with the last letter is, this is written shortly after the battle by a surgeon of the 2nd Maryland Infantry, Theodore Diamond. Diamond was actually from New York State, but he was assigned to the 2nd Maryland as their surgeon, and he sets up a field hospital after the battle and gives us an idea of the challenges of tending to the wounded. As this was my first regular field hospital, I will tell you how it was organized. In the first place, there was nothing detailed for me to begin with, and I had to form everything from the foundation. The first thing was I found that I must have power to control all acting under my orders. So out of stragglers, this is not your best guys. Your best soldiers aren't stragglers. I picked up in the vicinity, I organized a guard with a corporal at its head and divided into reliefs and stationed them where I wanted them, establishing order. The next thing was supplies and cooks and nurses. I started the driver with the ambulance with the requisitions for what I wanted to Keedysville. I picked out a sufficient number of cooks and directed the preparation of food and coffee, furnishing an adequate quantity of supplies for one day's rations at a time. I then divided the nurses into reliefs, assigning each one a given number of the wounded to take care of, and fixed the relief role for each. These were made up of stragglers, picked up on the road, my guard halting and taking possession of all passers until I filled my quota. So that's everybody who works in the hospital. Everybody is a straggler. That is These guys just pick them up, dragoon them, and make them nurses, make them cooks, make them orderlies, make them guards. On going the rounds to expect after dinner, some of these guys, they're not the best guys in the world. They're going to get into some trouble, right? I found one or two of the cooks and nurses had been willfully negligent of their duty to the wounded and were making themselves very comfortable out of the stimulants provided for the wounded. There was an orchard of apple trees convenient. I ordered the corporal of the guard to arrest these men and one of the guards also who had joined them and tie them up by their thumbs to the apple tree limbs so that their toes would just touch the ground and to keep them there till they were satisfied. They had to do just what they were ordered and be faithful to their duties or it would be worse for them. For a day or two, I had some apple tree suspensions and after that, everything went smoothly. All right. I mean, if we saw that today, us, we'd be outraged. I mean, the cruelty of that. He's not dealing with like upstanding, really nice people. These are rough dudes that he's dealing with. He's got to deal with them in a rough way that they understand, I mean business. I'm going to have discipline in this camp. We're trying to save these people's lives, and I'm not messing around. He's fair, but he's tough. And I think the people there respected that about him. He writes to his wife. This is actually a field hospital at Antietam. That's the surgeon of the 14th Indiana that you see there in the photograph. He writes to his wife, I'm slowly traveling through the disposal of and provision for 140 poor fellows under my care here. Surgery, surgery, surgery. Food, food, food. Nurses, nurses, nurses. Cooks that get drunk. Everybody employed looking out for number one. Nobody caring for anybody else. What does that say to when we say, you know, people today aren't like they used to be? I mean, they used to be so much better. They treated people better. They were tougher. Diamond might question that. Surgeons come here to get me to take care of their sick, not knowing or caring to do anything but shirk them off onto me, in addition to my other cases. And when I refuse, asking and arguing about what they shall do with them. What shall I do with the people who are my responsibility? Why don't you take them? Oh, the incompetencies and pay drawers in this army is enough to ruin any nation. More than half the time I've been sick since I've been here, but I am not thoroughly well. So he's sick all the time, and he's still doing his job. I came here in 2 log houses and a barn. The medical director had deposited 140 men on the bare floors. They had not even straw under them. There was not a cook, nurses, or anything for them, and no provisions, dressings, or anything else. The next day, his medical director got a furlough to go to Staten Island with his wounded brother-in-law. They got thousands of casualties. This guy leaves with his brother-in-law to go to Staten Island. Well, I seized upon stragglers, orchard thieves, and anything, and made a guard of 6 men, gave them muskets. I then detailed out the rest, 5 cooks, 12 nurses, and got my own steward. I got a broken ambulance and set it off after dressings, medicines, food, and candles. Then went to work at the wounds, making a register between the whiles, and arresting nurses, cooks, and general thieves, and substituting others in their places, answering 40,000 questions from everybody meanwhile. A remarkable guy. But to read that account, you might imagine there is no system at Antietam. It is completely haphazard, and that would be wrong. There is a system at Antietam. Both the Confederates and the Union had it. The Union system was better, and the Union system had more supplies and more personnel to help with it than the Confederates did. The problem was Antietam overwhelmed the system, utterly overwhelmed it. And you ended up with situations like Theodore Diamond had to deal with that were very improvisational. But you can see here also the role of the surgeon. I mean, there was an effort in the Peninsula Campaign to actually get a dedicated medical corps, that people who would be dedicated just to serving in the medical facilities. And that was deep-sixed by Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, as a waste of manpower. They needed fighting men. They didn't need more people trying to take care of people. So, you grow and you learn from these things. As soldiers contemplated this battle, Captain John Whiteside spoke for many. He was in 104th New York when he wrote his mother. He said, some of us overtaxed our physical powers on that day, September 17th, so that we did not get over that day's hardships yet. This is October 4th when he's writing. And many of us, yes, very many of us, will never get over it until death overtakes us. And I'll leave the last word to Rufus Dawes. During the Gettysburg campaign, They're halted on June 18th, 1863 in Maryland, and they made a halt in the day's march, and the newsboys somehow get into camp, and he gets a newspaper from one of them. We got newspapers today. Our brigade newsboy got them through some way. The headlines say, "Rebels in Pennsylvania, another battle at Antietam on the Tappas." I hope not. I never want to fight there again. The flower of our regiment was slaughtered in that terrible cornfield. I dread the thought of the place. Thank you, folks. Yep.
Wow. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Scott, thank you so much for such a interesting, moving presentation, and something we often forget about, the soldiers' experiences in the battle. I advertised to put Scott out at the table, so I'm going to ask you all to hold your questions, because you must get a copy of his work, and then get the first volume as well, because you need a lot of reading material. And we want to thank all of you for attending Sacred Trust. And I also want to say I want to thank our National Park Service partners for all they do. I want to specifically thank our little committee, Dr. Carol Reardon, the chairman of our education committee, Chris Gwynn, the chief of interpretation and education here at the Gettysburg National Military Park, for helping secure the speakers. I want to thank the staff of the National Park Service at Gettysburg for all their work over the anniversary, and the staff of the Gettysburg Foundation, both facilities and marketing, for helping us here put on the Sacred Trust programs. If you're not part of the family at the Gettysburg Foundation, you know the commercial from Carol Reardon and myself. Please be part of that family. Go out to the Friends Desk. They would love to have you as a member. And if you're already a member, when you get that solicitation, look at all the great things that you've done with your donations. So once again, thank all of you for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.